So I'm back with part 2 of my look at the Nioh Remastered collection on the PlayStation 5. Nioh 1 has already been covered, go check that video out in the link on screen and below. It has some advantages, but don't expect earth-shattering results. But here in Nioh 2, there's much more to discuss, and that PC version. Let's take a look, or die trying. Nioh 2 is really an extension of Nioh 1. It has improvements and tweaks, but it really is the same game enhanced and moved over to a better engine and obviously better ideas overall. The PS4 version right up to the top has been improved. So they've improved the engine, the lighting, the materials, the characters, the animation, the particle effects, the depth of field, and obviously added in that beautiful per object motion blur, which really helps the fluidity and smooth movement in this title. When you have the option to turn it on, even at 30 FPS it can help, although the dithering and the sampling patterns on it are a little lower on the PS4 than they are on the Pro, and certainly on the PS5. This is one area that stands out. You get some dithered patterns, as you can see as I pause it, which stands out a little more obviously on the PS4, but generally it's a much better title across the board. But it's still one that struggles with resolution on this base console. 720p is pretty much it now for the action mode. Those fleeting moments on the previous version which went to 810 or even 900p, they're gone. It now just pretty much sits at 720p. And then the action mode is the best one to choose. The movie mode is now pretty much a 30 FPS. That variable rate is pointless and it can drop below. So it's somewhere around 26 to 30% worse, and that's because they've improved the quality of the engine, they've added more to the rendering, and they've made it a harder title to run, and therefore you see that in the overall performance on the base PS4. It's still a good looking title, but as you can see here with a section with one of the bigger bosses and battle in it, it just hovers around that 30 FPS level far more often than it should, and even in clear open sections it's hovering around 45. It can leap up to 60 when nothing's on screen, and then it just goes straight back down to those 30 FPS. So don't turn it on, there's no point. Use the action mode or cap it to 30 and struggle through. But again, those input times are all affected and they're all identical to what you've just seen on Nioh 1. There's no difference. Team Ninja have refined the title. They certainly improved the engine, they've improved the visual quality, they've improved a lot of the effects, the particles, the shadow casting light sources, and the shadow cascades are all better. But artistically is where they've really enhanced the title. More flamboyant and confident art direction, better use of lighting, materials, character models are better, skin shading is better, and generally physics on both animation and cloth is better. But that comes at the cost of performance on the lower consoles. The Pro is like a refined version of the PS4. As per Nioh 1, it does still scale in action mode, 1080 down to 720p, but it does tend to hover more at 1664 by 936 or even 900p more often than not. So you can see there has been an impact there in terms of the load. So it's not a 1080p game all the time on the Pro now. The benefit is it still is pretty much a locked 60 FPS, certainly more consistent than many other titles that target that rate. As before though, it does have another mode, movie mode, which obviously has a variable choice. That means you get 3840 by 2160 via a checkerboard solution if you cap it at 30, or it dynamically scales within that checkerboard solution at that variable rate, going down to 1536 by 864, and it can also hover generally around 2304 by 1296. That checkerboard solution does a decent job at trying to improve the image quality, but it's certainly not the best checkerboard solution I've ever seen, with obvious issues in alpha transparencies, shading effects, inner shading of vertices and objects generally look quite dithered, and because of that dithered shading passes that are used abundantly across the title and the amount of hair and alpha transparencies and alpha to coverage that's used, it does tend to stand out quite significantly. And for me, I personally would have chosen just a straight 2560 by 1440 and then dynamically scale from there. That would have been a better option in my opinion, overall image quality. And it does again prove, just like I've said many times, this title's a classic one for it, that resolution alone is not the most important thing. It's the quality of the resolution. And even though checkerboarding can be brilliant, and we've seen that in many titles, in this particular one it's not the best implementation I've seen. And that's largely down to the fact that doesn't have a strong anti-aliasing, certainly a temporal anti-aliasing solution that will enable those alpha transparencies and those dithered elements of that checkerboard rendering solution to be merged together temporally across multiple frames. If they had a TAA implementation in here, then it will probably look a lot better and a lot smoother, but you would lose some of the clarity of image that it does have generally because of that lack of TAA. But performance is the issue, and again it can inconsistently run somewhere between 60 and 30 and anywhere in between, and the examples here in the same sections as you saw from the action mode means again it's not my preferred option, and generally it performs worse than Nioh 1 did on the PS4 Pro because it's pushing the engine harder, it's pushing the hardware harder, and therefore you get some sacrifices. And this is where the remaster comes in on the PS5. Effectively being close to the original PC release, it doesn't actually have any better assets overall. It certainly uses the higher quality where it can, but this generally transpires to just better quality textures being loaded more often in the frustum rather than anything being better overall. It just means you get less mip-map pop-in or blurrier textures into the distance. Filtering is much better, shadow maps are of higher quality, and alpha effects are also of a high resolution. And what you can also see here is the pop-in is significantly improved on the PS5. It's not resolved at all, but you can see these imposters, these sprites that turn to geometric higher level LODs of trees come in much later on the PS4 Pro, right on the edge of the bench, which is much further up the lane on the PS5. And that's what the PC and the PS5 allows you to do. It allows you to push it further out. It doesn't resolve it because it's an inherent process of the engine. It just reduces it. But it also shows that that action mode doesn't really heavily scale the engine back. Certainly you get reduction in shadow cascades, you get a slight reduction in the alpha effects and obviously resolution, but you really only get a cutback on the animated shadow maps, which no longer animate now, and everything draws in much closer to the camera. But going from action to movie mode and then straight over to the PS5 mode and then the top end PC, the leaps aren't drastic. And again, it's just more refinement than any significant improvement. And that even comes down to things like tessellation, which is running on the 120 FPS mode. Yes, it's reduced slightly, but it's still there, and therefore it's obviously not a huge impact on the engine and certainly on the hardware. But probably this most significant cutback is the shadow maps. So on the 120 FPS mode, they're no longer animated for objects, and then in the graphics mode, they're of a high resolution and high quality. And then over on the PC, they're not quite as good as the highest settings. The highest settings have a slight soft penumbra edge, so they're a slightly better filtering, but the difference between low and medium is almost non-existent. Medium looks slightly higher than the one you see on the consoles at 120 FPS, but again it looks like the filtering, and if you compare those against the PC, which I'll do in a moment, there's not a huge difference. So it's a very minor change between that and what you get on the PS5's graphics modes. The very maximum settings at a native 4K here on the PC is pretty much identical to what you get on the PS5's in graphics modes, which again is a native 4K with dynamic resolution scaling enabled, but in this graphic mode it tends to hover somewhere around 1800p or 1890. The PC here in this overclocked RTX 2070, more like a 2070 Super or an overclocked 3060, it can dip into the 30s at points but hovers somewhere around the 40s most of the time. Shadow map resolution test here, you can see that going from off to on takes 9.2%, and then from low to medium is 1%, and medium to high is 3.6%. So 13.3% from lowest to highest is obviously doesn't sound like a lot, but in rendering times it's a huge amount, and it certainly makes an impact. But even here at 1440p, no DLSS, I'll touch on that in a moment, you can see that it does not get anywhere near close to a locked 120. It's generally sub 100 FPS no matter what you're doing, and once you get into combat, even in these settings here, it can drop as low as the 70s at points, and therefore it's inconsistent. Now there is some limitations on the PC settings. It's not the best game in terms of what you can tweak and what you can change, but once you go to medium settings, which has that impact of bumping it up a little higher, you know, around 12%, then you can see somewhere into the 50s at the worst points. Heavy pyrotechnics, heavy effects, depth of field kicking in, but generally it's very, very inconsistent, which makes it unusable even with a VRR display, because you couldn't get that kind of variety of scaling of frame rates. It just wouldn't feel consistent enough. You can't fix it when it's fluctuating almost 100%. Whereas on the PS5 at these almost identical settings, it doesn't perform anywhere near that level. It's pretty much a locked 120, and that's largely because it's pretty much a locked 1080p. I didn't find any points in this particular version, and I counted quite a few in the title that go above 1920 by 1080. It appears to be fixed at that resolution at 120 FPS mode. And that means that you get a stability in performance that you just don't get on the PC at that level and that resolution. And that makes sense because it then becomes very GPU bound, as you can see on the previous PC test that I had a minute ago. And in this identical battle, it's pretty much 120. There is a few skips. It tends to jump into these 25 millisecond skips at certain points on the PS5, which is an odd one because that doesn't happen on the PC. It generally sticks consistently in that next refresh of 16 milliseconds. That next 8 millisecond time is used up. But overall, the game is pretty much a locked 120 FPS. You can run through battles and attack little enemies and bigger enemies and lots of pyrotechnics and effects. And because it's running at 1080p, it doesn't seem to struggle. What does happen is sometimes when you're moving the frustum, the camera, when things are coming in and out or being cooled, I think, the cooling process is causing an impact on the engine. I don't know what that might be. It might be CPU, it might be GPU, it might be just something in the code base going off tangent, but it can cause these skips into 8 or 25 milliseconds into the next section, so you can literally get a 16 millisecond spike on the PS5. Very, very rare on the PC. It does happen, but it's very rare. And these happen when things are moving around in fast action. You can sometimes get these skips. So they're not inherently a GPU issue, but they're something to do with how they handle it. And it's inherent to the engine. It's not hardware. But then in the higher sections, when you're getting streaming sections in, where things are loading in at certain sector points, we've got multiple paths to go on, it can judder. You can see it here coming up now. So it judders, and you get that on every single format, on every piece of hardware, and you'll get it everywhere. And you can feel it. So it can consistently judder and go down to the lower points in the car overall, around 110 FPS. It can go lower than that on the PC. And they're the points where it's loading things into RAM, or it's at least instantiating things. I don't know what the issue is, but it generally feels, juddery, even at 120 FPS, and you can feel these moments, but they're generally quite rare. And overall, it's how I would play the game because it's the most performant of the lot. But you can see here in the same sections over and over again, you can come back and forth, and it will just keep doing it. It's inherent to the sector points in the title. It's not inherent to the hardware, how it's being utilized. What is being utilized is the I/O system of the PS5, and certainly the SSD, so loading, which is an area where many will get excited, and it works well on the PS5 here. You can see it's at best 3.5 times faster than it is on the PC, both with NVMe SSDs. It's 2 gigabytes on the PC and obviously 5.5 gigabytes raw on the PS5, but overall it's 50% slower on the PC or 100% faster on the PS5. So that's a significant gap, and that would be bigger if there was more data to fill. And then you can see the Ps4 Pro is still pretty good. It's slightly behind the PC again with an SSD here, so it's not really the SSD that's holding it up. It's how it's utilizing and filling that in. And like I've already mentioned, the RAM is not really maximized here. It's a PS4 game at heart, so it doesn't utilize a huge amount of RAM in terms of storage space in the VRAM system because it doesn't need to. Therefore, it's not got as much to fill up. So that gap could actually be bigger if it was a bigger game using 12 gigabytes or 14 gigabytes of RAM. It might even take much longer, and therefore the delta would be even bigger than what we're seeing here. So that's good, that's impressive. That's already early signs that teams can utilize that on the PS5 without a lot of work. And going back to the performance, so running these two side by side in one of the stress areas of the title here, you can see that both 1080p, both at low settings, the performance between the PC on this 2070 Super, so a 2070 overclocked, you can see it's nearly 22 gigahertz overclock. It's around 14%, or it is just over 14% average slower in this one section, but the highs to lows are 18 to 20%. So you'd need something much more powerful than what you've got here to get to the level of the PS5. A 2080 would probably do it, or a 3070, absolutely. So it's good in terms of just pure rasterization. It's a good example of just where the PS5 is, and it's a great example of it. But you can use DLSS on the PC, and that's great, and that's a benefit. So we need it here, as you can see, because it doesn't have that 120 FPS option. You can obviously use it for 4K, and that's really where it pays off. So even running at 1440p with DLSS at performance, the best they've got, it's still sub 100 into the 90s. You can see this run here on the same section. So you don't really get that performance. You'd have to push it down to something like 1296, DLSS it from there, and you probably get similar performance to what you're getting on the PS5 at that slightly better image quality. It's not as good as native 1440, but it's certainly better than 1080p because of the way it sharpens the image and improves that image quality. It does use sharpening a little bit more. In games like this that don't have high AA, it can stand out a little more, the reconstruction element of how that's working. But I'm glad that PC players seem to have adopted that now and embraced it in terms of it's better to utilize the hardware to get better pixels rather than just more pixels through the pipe, and that's exceptional. That's exactly what we need. Then the final part is the performance. The performance on the PS5 is exceptional in terms of input times, as I covered before. You can see that on Nioh 1 and Nioh 2, it's nearly 40% better at that 120 FPS mode. So for me, it's the one I'd choose because the game doesn't benefit massively from 4K image quality because of the textures, the assets, and details. This does much better than Nioh 1, but I think that middle ground that you can get somewhere with that DLSS solution, or again, if you just have the relevant TV, I'd run it at 1080p and 120 FPS because it just feels so much smoother and better. But overall, the performance even at 4K on the PS5 is very, very consistent. Again, if you want that on the PC, you have to use DLSS. It can keep this machine slightly above 60 most of the time. It can dip occasionally, but it's not really that big a problem. It generally runs pretty well at 4K DLSS at 60 FPS. It's consistent enough to be a choice. But 120 as well I'd go because the title really benefits from it because of its fast input requirements. Anyway, that's it for another deep dive into Nioh 2, the complete remastered collection. Again, it's not a massive improvement over the original Ps4 Pro release, and you're not missing out significantly if you don't have a PC of a high-end spec. You're pretty much getting that on the PS5. So if you've got it already, you're not missing anything. If you haven't got it, then obviously PC or PS5 is the best place to play. Anyway, as always, I hope you like this. I'm completely self-funded and independent here, so if you can support, please share, like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and obviously ring the bell because that seems to be important. And I'll catch you on the next one.